listed here that kind of flourished to kind of promote and support communities and activity in grassroots innovation, community-based innovation, of various periods of time. So we deliberately went for diversity to try to see if there are any recurring dilemmas that can keep cropping up across these diverse contexts in terms of time and place, and obviously play out differently, but nevertheless we could learn from one another, seeing how others address similar sorts of dilemmas. And we did that using a kind of mix of concepts and approaches from science and technology studies, sociology of technology, and social movements and theories. And we're particularly interested for each of these movements, how they framed innovation and understood it, and understood the wider world. The kind of spaces they tried to open up and occupy in order to do the activity of technology, and what kind of dilemmas they confronted as they tried to have a wider influence. Excuse me. And I'm going to talk about one now, which is the one at the top, the movement for socially useful production, really because, as Chris said, what we're trying to do now, in opening up and really engaging seriously, and as a starting point, the politics of technology, and maybe a kind of democratic impulse, or an impulse to try and democratise technology. I thought it might be interesting to look at the movement for social use production, which shared those sorts of ideals, if you like, operating in the UK in the 1970s up to the 1980s, and actually was one of the kind of strands that I think kind of motivated early developments in participatory design. It had links with Scandinavian design researchers like Perrier and so on. And then I'll try and relate that. So I'm just going to tell you a story about what happened there, basically. If I make any kind of cultural references or things about the UK and this sort of history that are kind of unknown, you don't know, then please do stop me and ask for kind of clarification. Or if you have questions anyway. But then, having told that story, I'm going to try and then relate it in two ways. One, to the sort of another chapter in the book, a case study we did, which was this sort of recent growth in hackerspaces, fab labs, and makerspaces, and see what kind of lessons we can carry over, if you like. And then if there's time, I've got some diagrams to sort of illustrate a bit how we might conceptualise these sorts of movements and what they're trying to achieve in a fairly sort of simple way. So, the movement for socially useful production really began at a company called Lucas Aerospace, which was a manufacturing electromechanical company, had 17 factories around the UK, and like many manufacturing companies in the UK in the early 1970s, was struggling and under threat for a number of reasons. One was technology development, computer numerically controlled machine tools, automation of manufacturing and computer-aided design that threatened skills and livelihoods of the workforce. The other was kind of restructuring of capital and capital moving away from investing in manufacturing in the UK and into things like services and real estate, and realising that you could make money more easily than owning and trying to manage a factory. And the other was sort of the emergence of increasing competition internationally and companies relocating. And Lucas Aerospace wasn't alone in that. What was interesting about Lucas Aerospace though was that about half of its products were the customers, the defence sector, went into things like warplanes and military equipment. So it was weapons kind of manufacture, components for those sorts of things. And also it was going through a kind of series of rationalisations and sort of the organisation of the company that were being funded by the state as well. So public money was going into that restructuring, some of that restructuring that was threatening jobs and livelihoods. And then of course, when workers were lost their jobs, made unemployed by some of these sort of pressures and changes, they might be receiving unemployment benefits from the state as well. And that got some of what the workers, and here's a picture of the shop stewards, of kind of the trade unionists on the shop floor, the factory floor, got together across the different unions and thought about how to better coordinate the kind of typical actions to resist or to do something about these threats to their their working conditions and their jobs. So there were occupations of the factory, there were strikes and so forth. But in addition, they thought, well, they began to do some analysis amongst the workers, amongst their colleagues, about, over half of our products are publicly funded. This restructuring is publicly funded. Maybe we'd be better, rather than paying us to be unemployed, what's if we took all that money and used it to invest in socially useful production and moved out of armaments and weapons manufacture and into other, what kind of things could we make in these factories with the skills that we've got, with the equipment we've got? And how might we engage in some of these new technologies that are coming in and think about shaping and helping to design and shape their use in ways that enhance the skills of the worker and extended their capabilities rather than just displace them in the sort of vision amongst the management consultants of the time of the workerless factory, full automation and so forth. So they opened things up and they went through an exercise about opening design, prototyping, and came up with this thing in 1976, so just over 40 years ago, an alternative plan for their company, which they launched with great publicity, and listed over 150 kind of designs and prototypes for the sorts of things that they could make. And I'll come back to that a bit, but there's things like hybrid electric vehicles or motor systems, wind turbines, heat pumps, disability devices, medical equipment, all sorts of things, okay, that were sort of coming from the workforce side. Now, ultimately, management rejected that. I mean, we have to remember this is 40 years ago, so that actually the idea that non-professionals, non-experts should be involved in these sorts of issues or questions of design was quite a weird thing for a lot of people to get their head around. And so management rejected. Ultimately, they got little support from government as well. Interestingly, their trade union hierarchy as well, the people at the top of the organisation were hostile. They were accustomed to negotiating pay conditions and good payments when workers lost their jobs. They weren't so comfortable with getting into questions of workplace democracy and who gets to decide what gets made in these factories. But also the idea that these upstarts from the shop floor could have a say and shape things was also perhaps a bit threatening. But there was a lot of interest from some of the kind of newer social movements that were becoming a bigger part of public life in the UK as elsewhere. So the peace movement and environmentalists were very interested in this thing coming not from the sort of middle classes, but from working class people in their communities that were talking about arms conversion and a lot alternative environmental sort of eco-technologies. Okay, so they were very intrigued by this and began to sort of, certain alliances and support began to emerge, and began to take on a movement sort of identity. There were people interested on the left about questions of industrial democracy and community participation, and they got involved in promoting the Lucas Plan and working with them on how to develop some of the prototypes and press for the right to socially useful production. And indeed, workers and trade unions at other factories around like car manufacturers, other defence or military sectors started producing their own plans as well. There were links forged internationally with Scandinavia. Okay, so there were the sort of design researchers beginning in the Utopia project, say in Sweden, these sorts of things. Very much, we're writing and how they were inspired by things like the Lucas Plan, because of this commitment to workplace and industrial democracy. And then also, with the questions of new technology, interest in how can we develop more human-centred, skill-enhancing new technology. So a kind of movement emerged with these sort of uneasy alliances. And I thought what I'd do is show a film. This is a trailer. What's been really interesting about this, I started doing research, I knew about this for many years, and then about 3 years ago I had an opportunity to study it as part of this project. And what's been really interesting is how it's been attracted a lot of attention, and not just for me academically. There's a film, this is the trailer for a film that's being made, really arguing why we need this stuff now as well, really. So I'm going to show you the trailer to give you a flavour of some of the people involved, and then we can sort of see, well, does it really matter? Because in some respects, the UK is a very different country to 1976. In other respects, not. But you know, what we can explore together, say what's relevant about this story now. But, you know, it's.
When you're looking for a job, you're looking for a job. You don't make choices. Some people do. Some very principled people make a decision not to work in the arms industry or whatever. But you go to a company because you're going to get paid and you're going to feed your wife and kids and whatever.
But then when you get settled in, you get more confident. You then entitled to say, well, why am I doing this?
This is a story about when these workers' livelihoods were threatened and they came up with an alternative plan.
And it's one of the most remarkable exercises that's ever occurred in British industrial history. We thought that we have a very highly skilled, very competent workforce, and we have the intelligence amongst ourselves to devise or endeavour to solve the problems for ourselves.
Because it's a very small step to go from power generators on aircraft to wind turbines.
A plan that's even more pertinent today.
And you'll see things in there, cheap, efficient heating systems like heat pumps, hybrid engines for motor vehicles.
What this corporate plan was saying was you make socially useful products. And when we look at cutting back on defence, what could you do with the skills that you've got, with the capital that you've got? What could you do? What could you make if you weren't making that?
What we're saying is that we can use our expertise, our technology, we can use the existing plant, and we can produce things like kidney machines.
Yeah. Not only to show that jobs could be saved by the manufacture of alternative products, but actually jobs could be created by reductions in military expenditure. If that had been spent on mass transit, heating system, solar power, wind generation, all of those sectors would provide more jobs.
And it all happened 40 years ago. 150 alternative products developed from the shop floor for a more sustainable world.
And if you think you can do that with the entrenched power structures you're up against, what we wanted to do was say, well, we'll go past management, right down to the shop floor, and then it'll go up. Obviously, you know, you're turning the world on its head. It's absolutely turning the world on its head.
Okay. If you look on, I think on YouTube, we were able to, as part of the research, we were able to get an old film from 1978, made by Dave Elliott at the Open University. We were able to put that up on YouTube. So if you want to look more on this sort of thing, you can, if you want to watch more on there, you can search Lucas Plan on YouTube and you'll get to it. As I said, they didn't really get very far within the company, but a kind of movement was formed and inspired various initiatives, and perhaps one of the most significant was in London in 1982, and perhaps particularly resonant for some of the things today, where you had a very socialist, quite left Labour council was voted into power for the control of the city, and was committed, set up something called the Greater London Enterprise Board to try and reduce and reverse the decline of manufacturing in the city and unemployment. Okay? And they were, in their manifesto and in their implementation, they were inspired by Lucas Plan and lots of other things. And so the board was committed to creating or rescuing companies and turning them into cooperative enterprises. They wanted to see in the loans that they make available to these companies evidence for industrial democracy and socially useful production. Intriguingly, one of the things they did is, well, first of all, one of the lead organisers of Lucas Aerospace, someone called Mike Cooley, who wrote a lot of interesting stuff. He wrote a book called Architects Will Be, which I'd recommend to you, had been fired by Lucas Aerospace, controversially, and he was recruited by Gleb, the board, to be the technology director. And he, one of the things he did was to encourage the creation of what they call 5 technology networks. And these were community-based workshops that were set up in London, in different parts of London, and sort of themed. And you have them here. Okay? Maybe the one that might be most interesting to some of you here is the London New Technology Network, which is exploring issues of computers and so forth. And the idea was to kind of, as it says here, combine the untapped skill, creativity, and sheer enthusiasm in local communities with the kind of reservoir of scientific and innovation knowledge in London's polytechnics or technical universities. Okay? And in the idea with the networks was to provide access to tools, expertise and training. You could just walk in off the street. They were sited away from the polytechnics, okay, to try and make them less alienating to people. Remember, back then, less than 5% of young people or in the UK would go to university. Okay? So for a lot of people, a very weird thing. But people would you could come to these workshops and access this design, the manufacturing tools and ICT, bring your ideas. Okay? And there are a variety of examples of initiatives happening in the workshops. A women's computing cooperative was set up, brass tack, like refurbishment of white goods and giving them to kind of disadvantaged households, disability devices, play equipment, so on and so forth. Okay? And there was a product bank. If you came and used the facilities and came up with an idea, you were encouraged to deposit that with the product bank so it could be freely available and shared by others as well. Okay? And over 1,500 were deposited. And they were trying to cultivate participatory design methods, prototyping, but also interested in mobilising alliance of networks, as well as simply creating marketable or socially useful products that may have a market and enterprises and co-ops and so forth. So, well, let's go back. So I found this kind of intriguing. You can sort of, I don't know, for those of you familiar with kind of ideas around hacker spaces or fab labs, so there's a heterogeneous kind of family of things, or maybe very argumentative family, but there's sort of resemblances and intriguing features here about a similar kind of aspiration, if you like. And as I say, I think what's really important to remember with all of this, thinking a little bit more analytically, is in addition to all of the kind of things that have been, what's being prototyped, yes, there are lots of artifacts, but also methodologies, new actors and alliances, new identities and subjectivities, arguably, as well, as people came in and started to realise what kind of potential they had. New infrastructure and facilities, networks, new concepts and agendas, this idea of socially useful production, what that is. Agendas around the democratisation of design and technology as well. And I think that's important now as well, to sort of think about the variety of things that are being kind of cultivated and generated. Some of them kind of immaterial but very important. But it was not all plain sailing, and this is where maybe some of the things, makes us pause and ask questions about initiatives today in some of these sorts of community workshops. There's a lot of working out and hard work within these spaces. So, opening the door is only the start. And I think this is something you see with Fab Labs being opened. You buy the equipment, you have the space, you may hire a technician. But to really make it engage, I'd say you need 3 or 4 community development workers who are just out there trying to understand how this stuff makes sense and works with that locale. Okay? And this is a lesson that they learned very much here as well. You have to encourage people to come in and change their routines and get involved and do something differently. Needs a lot of support and encouragement. And then once people are inside, they were finding that the workshop was not insulated from divisions in the wider social world. There were questions of gender and who had control over some of the tools and what have you, or how the workshop was organised, and whose priorities were counted, questions of ethnicity as well, and so forth. And so really having to work out how to make this a more inclusive space as well. Again, kind of community development type of activity, not a technical, knowing the tools and technologies so much. There was a lot of argument and debate about the purposes of doing this stuff. Was it about prototyping to enable to train people and empower them that way and help develop enterprises? Or are some of the more kind of activist-oriented people involved in these networks and working there and so forth, a more kind of technological agitprop about awareness raising and mobilising? So you're trying to prototype something that's not readily available on the market, like a small-scale wind turbine, and then encouraging people to ask questions about, well, why isn't that existing in the world? We can prototype it here. What does that say about, energy provision and ownership in the UK? And start to get into some deeper, more structural and political questions. So there was a sort of tension there between these two. Which were priorities, how to make the work in greater sort of harmony. Also, moving from prototyping into manufacturer requires a lot of effort, control over capital as well. There were promising designs, an electric bike, for example. But the idea that the Greater London Enterprise Board and the Greater London Council didn't have the capital and the resources to turn that into production and retain the manufacturer in the UK. So people prototyping had to go and look off to Germany and Italy and other places to try and get into production. Okay? So there's questions about how to control all that capital, which is right next door in the City of London, in order to kind of underpin some of these, this sort of democratising impulse. Maybe you need to democratise capital investment decisions as well. And then also, this really favourable kind of political economies. As I say, some of the old left hierarchies were kind of a bit, what's the word? Not very happy or weren't so enthusiastic about these sorts of initiatives, new forms of community activism and trade unionism. But also on the new right as well. Remembering this is late 1970s, early 1980s UK, so nationally we have Mrs Thatcher as Prime Minister, and the Conservatives in control of Parliament, which is on the other side of the River Thames to the Greater London Council building. And the idea that you could have socialism in one municipality in a context where, we had growing privatisation and so forth. The initial kind of steps into something that would, emerge and be labelled neoliberalism. This is beginning to be installed forcefully here. We had big year-long strikes. The trade unions were being regulated against and undermined and so forth. And just, I think the UK society was changing and going in a different sort of direction. But back then things were perhaps more open for debate. But significantly, in 1986, the national government of Mrs Thatcher closed down the metropolitan councils, which tended to be more left-wing in the UK. So the GLC was closed down, and with that went the Greater London Enterprise Board and the funds to support the technology network. So it was kind of closed down. Some activities persisted, but they kind of dispersed and diffused, and it were more things like providing training facilities for people to then become entrepreneurs or small businesses and get into the marketplace. And the more kind of activist and radical kind of aspiration found it harder and harder to get a foothold. And I think that's significant. You know, a lot of this happened because there were alternative spaces to go to. There were institutions within the trade union movement. Okay? There were research groups or research units where people from Lucas could go to develop their plans. There were councils like the GLC that had facilities, had polytechnics. They could make things happen. Yeah, and again, so this, and I think with the UK, those sorts of spaces kind of were either closed down, like the GLC, or sort of diminished and restricted. Okay, spaces for alternatives. Now, one thing that a lot of innovation research shows is you need diversity, is that kind of to cultivate innovation and drive things. It's a very socially useful thing to have as a kind of meta thing, and we were kind of losing that, I think, in the UK. So that really covers this last point about how important radical impulse and places to go where the rules are different to do things are so important. Okay. So that's the kind of story from the past. I thought I'd try and a few reflections. I mean, maybe you've got your own. I don't know if is everyone. I know you've got workshop facilities here, but you know the Hackerspace Fab Labs. Is everybody kind of familiar with it? And maybe this slide's redundant, but I mean, there's been a few people. I mean, globally, last decade or so, has been a flourishing of community-based workshops. Some of them self-organised, set up. Some, as with the technology networks created by an institution. But there's similar sort of issues. Here's a suite of tools, now very much facilitated by social media. These workshops are connected in to a much greater degree. But the ethos is similar, about enabling people to kind of come in and experiment with these technologies and prototype and develop things. Okay? But similar sorts of questions maybe, or things that we were seeing in the technology networks back then, featuring again now. You know, part of the discussion and argument, there's a lot of kind of boosterism going on with this, a lot of enthusiasm, and it's easy to kind of get swept away with that a bit. And some people are excited about, well, this could be about exploring more democratic practices in design, prototyping, and production. And others are a bit, well, hang on a minute, you know, maybe these are just a kind of surface phenomenon reflecting deeper structural changes around precarity and casualisation and so forth. And it's, you know, it's just a kind of another space where people have to go to kind of engage in startup entrepreneurship, with kind of Silicon Valley mythology or ideology around how technology develops and how you do it, and sort of textbook distractions. You know, they're not really going to deliver on this. And it's intriguing, and I think that's one of the things we try to do with the book, is, you know, this sort of reboot, this recurring idea amongst some people of this sort of tools for people agenda. And if we just give tools to people and enable them to use it, the kind of social changes of a progressive sort will kind of happen. And we've seen the whole Earth catalogue of appropriate technology and some of the other movements that we researched in our project. And I think, basically, kind of contrasting and comparing the two then, you know, the story I told in greater depth, because it's probably less familiar, about social use of production and sort of maker spaces today, is, you know, is these things really. You know, so there are certain sort of fundamentals, I would argue, that kind of endure and remain. And they will play out differently, but the point is that they need to be kind of acknowledged and addressed in some way and talked about. Yeah? The first is, you know, maybe not so unusual to people here, but you know, the varied roles that prototyping can play. That kind of agitprop, critical, you know, the traditional kind of critical theory and consciousness raising, and there's a route into making very real and visible some of the kind of deeper structures in society, social structures, questions of political power and economic power. Who has the right to decide what gets invested in and developed and so forth. Questions of gender, and so on. There are questions about the challenges involved in creating new social relations in these workshops that are different to the outside world. Okay. questions about connecting kind of grounded practices of making to the big forces of political economy. You know, it's like they were finding in the technology networks in London. You know, it's one thing kind of noticing and recognising that. Arguably, with some of their links with trades unions and the Labour Party, they were kind of able to connect with debates about political programmes and mobilising for political change. But as we saw, you know, they were kind of also the kind of politics in the UK was sort of going in a different direction to that. So how do you kind of, I don't know, make those connections? That's something I'm very intrigued and puzzling about. And how this connects to material culture and sustainable development as well. It's intriguing something that the products of the technology networks were kind of environmentally oriented. I think sustainable development is not, and even questions of social inclusion are not, you don't notice a lot of those things in Fab Lab meetups and things today. Okay, it tends to be a bit kind of celebrating being awesome and so forth. And it's not to say that it's not present; you just have to look for it. But to try, how do you make that the kind of norm, if you like, and have a material culture based around care and sufficiency, rather than just, you know, we can make it, so just because you can make it, you have the right to make it. Those sorts of questions. Okay, so I could sort of conclude it there, but I thought it might be interesting to just show a few pictures that illustrate how some of us in Science Policy Research Unit and others try and maybe conceptualise or organise some of these sorts of complex sort of histories and features into slightly more simpler sorts of forms. One of the things is to think about alternative spaces, like I said, where, if you like, you're trying to do specific initiatives or set up specific workshops that have an ethos based on certain kind of values, okay? And you're trying to find, okay, where on earth can we find a space, a place, you know, physically, but also socially, cognitively, where we can do this activity, where we mobilise the resources, material and immaterial, to do projects, okay? And how can others and institutions help that happen through funding and supporting specific initiatives? It's one set of activities that some of these movements were doing and are doing. The other is connecting up and networking and partnering and reflecting and learning, okay? And then the other is a kind of lobbying and activism to kind of get these sorts of values out to an ever-increasing set of spaces or places and institutions in society more widely and more generally. Okay? And that's sort of dynamic that we try to, or a way of organising our thinking and understanding about what's going on in these sorts of movements over time, like the movement for social use of production. Another way of thinking of it, this is sort of like the previous diagram, if you like, but with a kind of time dimension put along it, is to think about the sort of how, not just how these specific initiatives kind of link up, but also how a kind of more abstracted general kind of field or body of shared trajectory for developing this stuff develops over time. Okay? And in this sort of literature about how kind of niche spaces develop and become more robust and maybe under certain circumstances induce a transformation to the incumbent way of doing things, more general institutionalised way of doing things. The idea is that this has to become more and more robust over time. Okay? Expectations become more, positive expectations become more widely shared. The kind of social learning involved becomes more institutionalised, and the networks and resources that support it become more developed. And you get this trajectory that influences wider sorts of social changes. Now this can look a bit sort of teleological, but so, before I get into that, so there's sort of three kinds of processes going on here. Okay, one is this sort of aggregation and learning from specific concrete initiatives. Okay? Turning that into more codified and easily shared forms of knowledge. Okay? European platforms for social innovation, for example. Yeah? We learn from all sorts of social innovation initiatives, you know, like I have done with various projects, community energy, eco-housing, digital do-it-yourself kind of initiatives. Okay, we take some lessons and we codify them in a way that makes it easier for others to learn and share them. So the next application elsewhere happens with greater facility, maybe on a bigger scale, and so forth. That all looks nice and neat. Arguably, it's quite teleological, because there are complications. So the first thing is like, well, what to aggregate? What kind of knowledge do we want to aggregate? Whose lessons count most, and for what, and for why? Which direction to go in? Is this about, remember with the technology networks, is this about training and prototyping to set up business and cooperative? Or is it about changing the world and democratizing workplaces and so forth? You know, what kind of allies and interests do we need to bring into this arrow, into this space? Is it, you know, investors interested in business, or is it kind of, you know, political parties and so forth, depending on the kind of directions you want to go in? And then, of course, you can have answers to all those questions, but what also comes into these spaces, as we saw, was the wider world. You know, stuff happens and comes in and knocks you off course, or makes it very difficult to go in certain directions and not others, okay? So, one way of trying to understand that I've been working with in the context of community energy initially, but now trying to think through some of this makerspace stuff, through these three sort of perspectives on, if you like, what is this alternative space about? Okay, what are we trying to achieve? What knowledge are we aggregating and why? What directions are we trying to go in? And the first, and there's a literature on this, is strategic niche management. And here, it's very instrumental. You're doing some initiatives, creating some technology or some form of social organisation, and you want to know, okay, what works and how do we make it happen elsewhere? Okay? So it's very much how to kind of knowledge. That's sort of knowledge you're kind of abstracting up. Okay? So therefore, projects are just demonstrations of how to do it, and that it works, and the proof of concept. Intermediaries who support that kind of arrow, you know, there might be innovation agencies, there might be European Commission funders, there might be universities. Their role, what they're trying to do is simply disseminate good practice. And the politics in this, if you like, the presumption is that this is all very kind of rational and objectifying. It's obvious to everyone that this is a good thing, and these are the important lessons, and we need to do these things to spread it. It's very clean and strategic. Another perspective is to say, well, no, that's not really the case. You know, just because we think that this is a kind of nice innovational solution, that these maker spaces are great for certain things, doesn't mean the rest of the world does, particularly maybe policymakers or investors, people with funds, who we want to try and draw in and attract interest to. So another perspective is we need to advocate and persuade others that this is a good thing and that this needs to be supported in some way. So the kind of niche, if you like, the alternative space is seen as being about empowering the kind of grassroots innovators, the people in that space, okay? And persuading others in the wider social world that this is something that matters to them, okay? So if you like, the projects are presented, and the kind of knowledge is not so much how to do it, but why it matters. Right? So you might try and align what you're doing with prevailing policy discourses or net priorities, public discourse in society. And this stuff's great for addressing the problems of climate change or unemployment or the exclusion of youth from society or something. You're trying to align what you're doing, and you see that with Fab Labs. You know, they're very good at, these are incubators for entrepreneurship. They're great for getting kids into STEM education as subjects, and so forth. Okay, you kind of align the space to suit the kind of these sorts of agendas and preoccupations of those, those powerful others that you want to bring in and support. And so intermediaries are very much involved in lobbying, and the politics are argumentative and pragmatic. And then the third kind of way of seeing these spaces that I think particularly important and interesting is a kind of critical niche kind of space, where, and maybe this links, maybe something analogous might be kind of things like, critical technical practice or critical making and these sorts of arguments, or the technological agitprop that they were talking about back in the technology networks. Where really you're in trying to do something very different, you're making very visible, as I said, some of the kind of wider structural constraints in society. So when some of the community groups we were working with wanted to do a small hydro water-powered project, for example, okay, and they could get, understand the technology, they could get enough support, they could put it in, but the one thing they couldn't get was access, what they thought, to the water, the river, and the kind of weir, the site where they wanted to put it in, where there had been one historically, and they thought we could put it in. But then as they got into it, they realised that there was someone who owned that and wasn't allowing them access. So they got into questions of ownership of land and entitlement and all of these sorts of issues. Okay? Their critical awareness of how UK society works was kind of unsettled, was opened up a bit. Their presumptions were unsettled. And I think that's really important because you could go in and say about the concentration of land ownership and organise a public meeting in that village where they were doing it and say, right, tonight we're going to talk about ownership of land in the UK. And probably no one would turn up. But in doing a very practical project where people with very different ideas, ideologies, values, and sort of get involved in a certain way, it kind of surfaces those things in a way that's sort of meaningful to them and their aspirations. And I think that's very important. So the purpose is, when thinking about these spaces in that way, is to challenge norms, knowledge about structures, and the role of intermediary organisations, which might be more activist rather than consultancy up here. Different kinds of actors may be, prevalent in spaces working to these different perspectives. Intermediary here is about mobilising critical reflection, and the politics are very much more agonistic and radical. Okay, it's not to develop a workable solution necessarily; it's to mobilise people to try and change wider structures. And I think part of the politics in these alternative spaces is that these are present simultaneously and in interaction with one another as well. Okay, so now I'm not expecting you to be able to read this. This is illustrating kind of the working process. What I'm trying to work through at the moment, if you like, is read and understand what's happening in grassroots digital fabrications, in makerspace, and so forth, through these three perspectives. Okay, how are the local experiments understood? What are the knowledge priorities? Okay. How do the intermediaries, who's promoting and boosting that perspective? And then, what's the politics like through that sort of perspective? So, when kind of the Fab Lab Foundation strikes deals with Exxon and so forth to open up Fab Labs, maybe they're being quite sort of strategic niche management kind of view, with a bit of policy advocacy involved. So it's just a framework to kind of tease out and simplify for a moment some of the complexity, so we can then go back in and maybe ask some kind of personal questions and so forth. And that's it, really, I think. I said, hopefully with the story of the Lucas Plan, you can see that this Tools for People kind of agenda has a long history. Hopefully, I've convinced some of you maybe that actually knowing that history is helpful for doing stuff today. It's not just of academic interest, but if you want to do your projects in maybe a more politically savvy kind of way, you can learn with history to do that, because you'll kind of identify questions and issues that you either may not be able to do yourself, but may point you to organisations and agencies where you could get help or find other people who are trying to do themselves and mobilise themselves. Because I think ultimately these practices, and this is something that, I hear, although I'm not an HCI person, I participated in design, it's not my background, but when I talk with people and listen to people, it's the recurring theme is how do we kind of scale up, or how do we replicate, reapply this stuff on a wide, many locations, so it's the norm rather than an interesting exception. And I think I don't know how, but it's just noting, I think it comes to these connections with material culture and the digital economy. I've showed you these three perspectives, which I hope you might find interesting. And I think this is the key one, really, one to leave you with. Maybe, I don't know if it came across so much, but always asking, what are the power relations between these interacting perspectives? Which ones are more privileged? Which ones are easy to get funding for? And so forth. Yeah? Whose perspective and priorities count and so forth? This innovation is an inherently kind of political activity, which is where we started off. So that's it. Thanks for your attention. If you want to know any more, then these are a few references. There's lots more online. So thanks for your attention.